Welcome to the show. What you just heard is one of the most famous sounds in Dark Souls, as well as one of the most recognizable, the "you died" sound. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, death in video games. Now, death has been in games since the beginning. Space War, the first game ever, actually had it, and any game with combat has it. And it's a very common mechanic. It's a very common failure state in games. Unfortunately, the game's narratives almost every single time completely miss the opportunity to do anything with it. Most of the time, you simply reload a save and just keep going until you don't have to reload your save anymore. And while a lot of games do that and it's fine and it doesn't break the immersion too much, it's more that's not an exciting thing to do. That's not an interesting way to interact with an interactive narrative. What thankfully games have started doing now more than they have in the past is incorporating their mechanics into their narrative and their narrative into their mechanics. Now, what I mean by that, to paraphrase Zero Punctuation, is that narrative should inform the gameplay and gameplay should reinforce the narrative. And what I take that to mean is your gameplay should not be able to be divorced from your story, and neither should your story be able to be divorced from your gameplay. Because otherwise, why are you telling the story in a game when obviously some other medium would do just fine telling your story, or some other story could interchangeably be put over this gameplay, and it wouldn't change the tone or anything else really. And that's not what a game should be. A game should be able to tell its own unique story in a way that only a game could tell it, which is through interaction, in interacting with the game's systems and mechanics and just the world, and being able to interact with the world should carry some weight and carry some meaning. And if you get rid of that, then why are you telling the story in a game? Now, a lot of the time, death in games gets totally ignored. The game lets you overwrite all of your failures and just say, oh, that 15 minutes never happened, try it again. We're not counting. And, that's fine for certain kinds of stories in certain kinds of games, but that's not interesting. What I find intriguing is when games take "when you die, the story doesn't stop" to heart. And what I mean by the phrase "when you die, the story doesn't stop," when I describe that, it's really talking about the fact that the story, regardless of whether or not the story cares about the number of times you've died, the game acknowledges the fact that you died, and while it will reset some of your physical progress, and it might take away aspects of your progress like your money or, in Dark Souls' case, your souls and your humanity, the game isn't rewinding itself. It might set you back physically and economically in game, but it's not trying to just hit the rewind button. And I think that is something important to look at, because if you are hitting the rewind button, you're just continuously erasing somebody's story from the game. And, for some stories that is valid, as I've said before, but your goal when you're making a game should be the story you're telling cannot be separated from the game you're playing. They're integral to each other. And when you don't have the story stop to say, okay, you failed, go back, try it again, when the game just keeps going and says, oh, you died, you can get most of your progress back, but we're also not going to just give you back your progress. We're going to make you work for it. That really ups the idea that, this world is something real, and these game mechanics are integral to the world. And I think we need, as designers and developers, to remember that the stories we're making should be ingrained in the systems we're building, because systems can tell a really wonderful story, especially when they're backed up by a world. And that's something I think the Souls series has done incredibly well, is they've constructed this world of hopelessness, really. And everything in the game works towards giving you that feeling of dread and that feeling of hopelessness. And, when everything in your game is working towards that, people notice. They might not be able to articulate it, but people notice when the world is crafted with the mechanics in mind, or the mechanics are crafted with the world in mind. And when both of those work together, you get something far more complete and whole than you otherwise would. And going back to the phrase, when you die, the story doesn't stop, Dark Souls will reset where you're physically, and it'll drop a blood stain containing your humanity and your souls where you died, but it won't stop the game and rewind it. And that is something really important that I like to see in games, and it's been coming out more and more, is the idea that the story is contiguous and you are never going to hit the rewind button. You might physically set the player back, you might impede them in other ways to prove to them that there are consequences to them dying, but it's not taking you out of the world. It's instead keeping you in the world and then having the world itself give you the consequences. And, when a world itself is feeling like it's giving you the consequences, it just feels that much more alive and that much more real, even if what's actually going on is completely unrealistic. As in most games that use this mechanic, like the idea that you can't really die, that in itself is unrealistic, but you can tell very interesting and personal stories using that. And if you're reinforcing it with your mechanics, that story is going to hit home even more. I mentioned consequences in games a little bit, but I think it's an important topic to discuss because games with death in them, they do have a mechanical consequence, but that mechanical consequence, I've likened it to rewinding the story. That mechanical consequence isn't a part of the world. It's in no way, shape, or form a part of the narrative. And the narrative simply ignores the fact that the player died, so much so that it erases that part of the story where the player dies. And while it's still a perfectly acceptable mechanical consequence to set your physical progress back a little bit, the fact that it erases a part of your story is not terribly conducive to me getting lost in this world, because what I just did, what I failed at, is gone. I can't get it back because I loaded the save, or I just have to stop playing. And that's not what we want out of a game. We want to be able to keep playing the game and keep being immersed in this world. Now, I've talked about Dark Souls a lot and how its mechanical consequence is wrapped up entirely in its world. And it did it incredibly simply. All it did was label your money and experience as souls, and this number is your humanity. It didn't need to work terribly hard to add another layer of meaning to gold, and I'm not really sure how to liken the way humanity works in Dark Souls to really anything else because it's a fairly unique idea. But it really livened up the fact that the game's mechanics are telling you you are in fact losing your humanity as you play this game and die. And you have to work to get it back. You have to beat bosses, you have to play cooperatively with other people. You kill NPCs and steal their humanity. You can jump through a couple hoops and get the ability to just take other people's humanity. And that plays to the narrative as well as just an interesting mechanic in the game. As well, and the mechanic in the game then brings back its own consequences. To every time you die, you drop a blood stain containing all of your non-physical progress so far. And that really does help me suspend my disbelief in the idea that this world is alive and that this world itself has consequences. It's not just the game punishing me for failing, it's the game giving me a minor setback that I can possibly completely fail at to retrieve. And that's what gives me the suspension of disbelief with this mechanic is when I fail, the world doesn't stop and pause itself and the game takes over and says, you're done, try it again. The world doesn't care. And the game just keeps going. The game doesn't care that you died. Sure, it can be a little bit demonic about reminding you that you died, but the whole idea is the story doesn't stop. The world doesn't stop. The game never acknowledges that it's odd that you died. And that's something I think kind of beautiful about the way Dark Souls is designed. And actually, this isn't just Dark Souls, this is Demon Souls and Dark Souls 2. where they've taken their world and figured out how to mechanically implement consequences into the world from the game. And when games do that, I think you get a much more interesting and lively experience because, as I've said many times before, you're not being forced out of this experience to hit the load button or do you want to go to the main menu? Do you want to turn the difficulty down? No, that's not an option because this world is supposed to crush you. The whole tone of the game is actually based around this mechanic and the idea that this consequence to you dying is part of the world. It is ingrained. And as I've been saying this whole time, when your mechanics in your world are meshed, you get a complete experience. You get a complete story, more so than if you keep rewinding and overwriting people's stories. And that's why I think people have gravitated to a game like Dark Souls, in spite of how difficult and seemingly inaccessible it is. Because it has the quality of never taking you out of your world really to do anything. Everything in the game is reasonably in place in the world, and the world accepts failure. Now, the narrative itself doesn't really react to you dying. The narrative in the game doesn't really care about you dying at all. It's just the world allows you to. And I think the next logical step with a lot of these death mechanics is to make the narrative itself really care. And that's actually something Shadow of Mordor, I think, does a little bit better than Dark Souls. I think it has other problems that Dark Souls doesn't have, but I think Shadow of Mordor is a really good example of the direction I want to see more games go, in that they have a narrative impact on you dying. Where Dark Souls death mechanic is about making the world feel more oppressive and hopeless by putting all of your liquid progress into a single spot and then saying, okay, here's all your progress. Hope you don't die, because if you do, all your progress in that spot's gone. Shadow of Mordor is more about making the world more difficult through the enemies getting promoted and getting more ability through killing you. And that's something I really appreciate because it gets you far more invested in your enemies than it otherwise would. And honestly, it gets me far more invested in the enemies I'm fighting than most games I've ever played. Because when I get killed by an orc, that orc gets immediately promoted, he gets a name, and then he remembers killing me the next time. And as shallow as the Nemesis system is, it doesn't need to be any deeper because I project far more onto the orc than the game could ever throw at me, just because the game made it personal. And that's a really cool little trick that developers should look at, is make things in the game more personal for the player. They will get far more out of it than they otherwise would. And in addition to, I think, just a really well implemented system, the death in the game has a completely justified reason for existing and not actually permanently killing you, thanks to Lord of the Rings and its wealth of lore. And the narrative justification's fine. It's not terribly interesting when compared to the actual Nemesis system that builds off of its death system, but really the Nemesis system, I'd say, is an integral part of why the death mechanic is so good. Because when you die in game, if you got killed by an orc, the orc gets promoted, as I've said. Not only does that orc get promoted and he gets a name, but all of the unfinished events that are outside of the main story, those all resolve themselves. So not only does the orc that killed you get more difficult, the other orcs in the game, they all get promoted or get increase in power. And that in turn means dying has a ton of consequences. And those consequences are immediately made clear to the player. You are shown the minute you die, all the orcs that get promoted, all of the orcs that get killed, based on the events that you failed to complete before dying. And that's something really great because it's not a mystery that, oh, I died, who's getting what happening to them. No, the game tells you that all these orcs who are engaged in power struggles, they all had them resolved. And I mean, there's a bit of a problem where if you haven't figured out enough of the captains, it's not terribly exciting to see silhouettes of unknown captains murdering each other. But, that's kind of beside the point. The idea that you get shown the consequences of your actions immediately upon death is really nice, and the game doesn't have any qualms about showing them to you or making it clear that, yeah, you kind of screwed up, but you can try again. We're not going to stop anything. Just remember that you dying makes everybody more powerful. And that's something I like, where the game will hold your hand a lot, but in that instance, it while it gives you the information, doesn't really tell you what to do with it. And that brings me to an important contrast between Dark Souls and the other Souls games and something like Shadow of Mordor. Because Shadow of Mordor is incredibly explicit in how its death mechanic works. And honestly, I think it needs to be because of how complicated it is. Its death mechanic involves all of these orcs getting promoted and resolving all of these conflicts happening across the map. And I don't think it would work as well if they didn't tell you what happened, because it's such a complicated game with so many things happening. You do need to give the player more information. And I don't think it really breaks immersion too much, because it would make sense that you're listening and in the process of coming back, you want to figure out immediately what happened after you died and who got promoted. So in within the world of the game, I think it's fine. It makes sense, and I don't think it would have been as effective had they gone the more Dark Souls-esque route and not explained it to you. That being said, I really appreciate and respect how much work the developers at From Software put into making Souls very easily to understand once you start paying attention. Its death mechanic isn't really explained outside of every time you rest at the bonfire, you refill your health packs and your health, and all the enemies respawn. Outside of that, it doesn't tell you what to do. It does, however, make your blood spots incredibly inviting to go pick up, because they glow this bright sort of cyan color, and it's the only thing like that in the game. So it's very distinctive, and it invites you to pick it up. And that's incredibly important design, because at that point, the game doesn't have to tell you to go pick it up. It just makes it look like you want to pick it up because it's an item, and it looks like an item. And that's a really important aspect of overall design, is you want to make things intuitive. And that goes back to my point about Shadow of Mordor being a much more complicated system than just pooling all of your liquid assets and sticking them somewhere. And I've already discussed how much information Shadow of Mordor has to give the player to have them fully understand all the consequences to their actions and their death. That, I don't know how much better the game would be if you had to go listen to an orc's conversation about, oh, here's all the things that happened after so and so killed your character, or had to go interrogate an orc or find some piece of intelligence that the humans in the game left you. I don't think that would help the flow at all. And every time I see the tactical screen flash up that is describing, oh, here's all of the information you know about these orcs, here's all the stuff that happened to them, that just implies to me you have heard some conversation and this is the best way of showing it to you, rather than force you to sit somewhere and listen to actually get everything. I think that'd be much more detrimental to the flow of the game than the screen that they've implemented is. So, and interface is something I'm going to talk about later on another episode, but I wouldn't worry too much about the fact that the game is more explicit just because of the sheer amount of information it has to give you, compared to Dark Souls, and its systems are all designed to be really intuitive and not needing to be explained. Whereas Shadow of Mordor, it has a lot more obtuse things, and it has a lot more stuff on the screen in the first place. So I think it makes sense they have to feed you the information a little bit more clearly to really hammer it home. And I think that's just the type of game it is. I don't think it's better or worse than Dark Souls. I think it's still important to remember that everything in a game should be intuitive. And I think, frankly, Shadow of Mordor is a really intuitive game. It just is a much larger scale set of actions than something like Souls is, so it has to feed you more information in a less interesting and more explicit, here's the information way. And that's not, and like I've said, that's not necessarily better or worse, that's just the way it is. And looking at it, I don't think they really should have done it any other way, but that's up to the player base to decide. That's up to Monolith to decide whether or not they think it could have been better. My opinion is it's fine. So as we wrap it up here, I think the most important thing to take away from this entire discussion about death mechanics is when you're designing a game's world, you want to be able to justify all of the things going on in the game, in the world, because that way the world and the game are the same thing. And when everything's working towards the same goal or the same result, players are going to notice and they're going to think, wow, that felt really real. This world feels alive. Regardless of how much is actually happening and how much is implied, they'll still feel that the world is more real than if you keep pausing the game every time they die and say, okay, you just hit our failure state. Don't worry about all the stuff leading up to the failure state. Try it again. What just happened is gone. And to tie that whole idea back into the idea of games needing to be designed to be intuitive, I think a death mechanic is actually the most intuitive way we could implement a failure state into a game rather than bring up a screen that says, would you like to load your last save or load a checkpoint or just automatically do it? So, I'd say death mechanics are intuitive. You'd have to make sure they are designed to be intuitive, just like the rest of your game should be designed to be intuitive. But yeah, I think, in the interest of game design, death mechanics are a really good idea. They obviously don't work for everything, and this video is not about trying to say they should be in every single game, because obviously not every story should be told like that. But I think if you're trying to figure out something interesting to do with your world, consider death mechanics, because the games I've played with them, for the most part, when they're well designed, they've been excellent games. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel. And catch you guys later.